The great hall of Ironhold felt colder than stone had any right to be. Valentina stood before the raised dais where Alpha Cormac Steele presided, her hands clasped over the swell of her belly, 7 months grown and impossible to hide. The thin winter light filtering through the narrow windows did nothing to warm her, and the assembled pack watching from the shadows offered even less comfort. She had known this moment was coming. From the instant the healers had exchanged those weighted glances over her prone form, she had known. But knowing did not prepare her for the sight of Marcus standing at his uncle's right hand rather than at her side, his face arranged into careful neutrality, as if she were a stranger rather than the woman who carried his child. The hall smelled of old smoke and male dominance, of centuries of pack hierarchy reinforced through fear and submission. Valentina had stood in this space 100 times before, for ceremonies, for celebrations, for the simple business of pack life, but it had never felt so hostile. Every shadow seemed to lean toward her with judgment. Every whispered breath from the watching crowd felt like an accusation. "The healers have delivered their assessment," Cormac announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall with practiced authority. He was a large man, thick with muscle that had not softened despite his 45 winters, and his steel-gray hair was cropped close to his skull in the manner of a soldier. Everything about him spoke of strength, of dominance, of a world-view built on the simple premise that might made right. "The child will be a runt, small-wolfed, weak." The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the watching crowd. Valentina felt them, the shifted weight, the averted eyes, the silent judgment of wolves who had been taught since birth that weakness was a disease to be purged. Her wolf stirred within her, hackles rising at the threat implicit in that single word. Runt. Such a small syllable to carry so much destruction. She remembered the examination, the cold instruments pressed against her belly, the healers speaking over her as if she were not there. They had measured and calculated and pronounced their verdict without once asking how she felt, what she wanted, whether she loved this child growing inside her regardless of what their instruments revealed. "Given this," Cormac continued, "the pregnancy will be terminated. It is the kindest mercy we can offer, both to the child and to the pack. We cannot afford to dilute our bloodlines with—" "No." The word escaped her before she could consider the wisdom of speaking it. The hall went utterly silent. Even Cormac paused, his cold blue eyes narrowing at the interruption. "No," Valentina repeated, and she was surprised to find her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I will not allow it." "You will not allow it." Cormac's tone was almost conversational, the way a wolf might speak to prey that had momentarily forgotten its place. "And what authority do you imagine gives you the right to refuse?" "The authority of a mother." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "This is my child, my body, my choice. I invoke my right as the one who carries this life." A murmur ran through the crowd, some shocked, some disapproving, and somewhere in the back, so quiet she might have imagined it, something that almost sounded like approval. Cormac's expression did not change, but something in his eyes went flat and cold, like ice forming over a deep lake. He turned to Marcus. "Control your woman." Marcus shifted his weight. For one desperate heartbeat, Valentina thought he might speak in her defense, might finally show some trace of the man she had believed him to be. She remembered the early days of their courtship, when he had seemed kind, when his smile had felt genuine, when she had believed that being chosen by an alpha's nephew was a blessing rather than a transaction. But when he spoke, his voice was as empty as his eyes. "She is beyond reason, uncle. The pregnancy has made her irrational." The betrayal should have hurt more than it did. Perhaps she had been preparing for it longer than she realized. Perhaps some part of her had always known that Marcus loved what she could give him more than he had ever loved her. She thought of all the small moments that should have warned her, the way he spoke over her in conversations, the dismissive wave when she expressed opinions that differed from his uncle's, the subtle corrections that made her doubt her own perceptions. Very well. Cormac rose from his seat, and the hall seemed to grow smaller around his presence. Valentina Ashford, for your defiance of pack law and your insistence on inflicting weakness upon our bloodline, I hereby strip you of your status as a member of Ironhold Pack. You and your defective offspring are cast out. You have until sunset to leave our territory. She had expected it, but the word still struck like a physical blow. Around her, the pack that had been her home for 3 years suddenly felt as foreign as enemy territory. These faces she had known, these wolves she had taught and laughed with and considered family, they looked at her now as if she were already a ghost. Marcus. She hated the way her voice cracked on his name. Will you say nothing? He would not meet her eyes. You should have listened. It would have been easier. Easier. To let them cut her child from her body before she ever drew breath, to accept that some lives were worth less than others because healers with their instruments and their prophecies declared it so. Easier to surrender than to fight. Valentina turned away from him without another word. There was nothing left to say to a man who would trade his own child for his uncle's approval. They gave her an hour to gather her things. She was permitted 1 bag, whatever she could carry on her own. No help from pack members who might be contaminated by association with her defiance. She moved through the small cottage she had shared with Marcus like a woman in a dream, selecting what would help her survive. A change of clothes, a warm cloak, a knife Marcus had given her before everything changed, a small portrait of her parents who had died when she was young. She paused at the cradle she had already begun to assemble, the wood smooth beneath her fingertips. She had carved some of the decorations herself. Tiny wolves and moons and stars, dreams made tangible for a child who would never sleep here. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm her. Then she straightened her spine and turned away. She could not carry a cradle through the wilderness, but she could carry hope. At the gates, a crowd had gathered. Most watched with the cold satisfaction of wolves who believed justice was being served. A few looked troubled, their gazes sliding away when she tried to meet them. One young woman, Ira, who had been a student in the classes Valentina taught for the pack's pups, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her face. Here, Ira whispered, pressing a small leather pouch into Valentina's palm. It's not much, but it should help you buy food for a few days. Valentina closed her fingers around the pouch, feeling the outline of coins within. You shouldn't have done this. If they find out, then let them. Era's voice cracked. What they're doing is wrong. Everyone knows it, even if they're too afraid to say it. Some of us... She glanced over her shoulder, checking for listening ears. Some of us remember that wolves are supposed to protect, not destroy. A guard's rough hand closed around Valentina's arm before she could respond, pulling her toward the gates. She had just enough time to see Era disappear back into the crowd before the iron bars loomed before her. The ceremony was brief and brutal. They cut a braid from her hair, the one that had held the silver clasp marking her as Ironhold, as belonging. The metal clattered against the cobblestones, and no one moved to retrieve it. She watched it lying there, glinting dully in the winter light, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was not losing herself. She was being freed. You are no longer pack. Cormac's voice echoed from the walls. You are no longer wolf. Go, and may your choice bring you the suffering you deserve. The gate swung open onto a world of gray sky and frost-hardened road. Valentina stepped through without looking back. Behind her, the iron crashed closed with the finality of a tomb, sealing shut. She walked. The road wound through ancient forest, the trees bare and skeletal against the winter sky. Snow began to fall before she had gone a mile, dusting her shoulders and catching in her hair. Her feet, clad only in thin leather boots never meant for long travel, began to ache with cold almost immediately. But she kept walking. One hand pressed against her belly, feeling the subtle movements within. Her daughter, she was certain of it, though the healers had refused to confirm. Restless and alive and completely unaware that the world had already decided she was worthless. "We will prove them wrong," Valentina murmured, the words forming small clouds in the frigid air. "You and I, we will find a place where we belong, and we will prove every one of them wrong." The baby kicked in response, a tiny flutter of movement that felt like agreement. By nightfall, Valentina had found shelter in an abandoned woodcutter's cottage. Half its roof collapsed, but enough remaining to keep the worst of the snow at bay. She gathered what dry wood she could find and managed to coax a small fire to life, barely enough to warm her hands, but better than nothing. The cottage smelled of must and old wood, of abandonment and forgotten purpose. Mice scratched in the walls, and somewhere in the rafters, an owl hooted its mournful cry. Only then, in the flickering shadows with no one to see, did she allow herself to weep. She cried for the life she had lost, for the man who had never truly been hers, for the pack that had cast her out like refuse. She cried for her unborn child, who would enter a world that had already marked her as lesser, as weak, as something to be culled rather than celebrated. She cried for her parents, dead these many years, who would never know their grandchild. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned and there were simply no tears left. And when the tears were spent, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and began to plan. There was one place she knew, where outcasts sometimes found refuge. The Alpha King's territory lay to the north. 3 days' travel if she pushed herself. The stories painted him as brutal, merciless, a monster who ruled through fear rather than respect. They said he executed wolves for minor infractions, that his punishments were swift and terrible, that he had never taken a mate because no woman could survive his attention. But the same stories whispered that he had a strange mercy for the broken, that his pack was full of wolves who had been cast out of other territories for one reason or another. Wolves who should have died but somehow thrived under his rule. Perhaps, Valentina thought as the fire burned low and her daughter kicked restlessly against her palm, a monster's mercy was better than no mercy at all. She left at first light and walked for 3 days through snow and silence. The road grew rougher as she traveled north, less maintained, the signs of civilization fading into wilderness. She ate sparingly from the food she had managed to bring, supplemented by what little she knew of winter foraging, dried berries still clinging to bushes, nuts cached by squirrels who had not returned for them. On the second night, she found a cave that offered better shelter than the first cottage, and she slept with her back against cold stone and her arms wrapped around her belly. She dreamed of her mother, who had died giving birth to a stillborn brother when Valentina was 8. In the dream, her mother smiled and pressed a hand to Valentina's cheek and said, "The strongest wolves are the ones who learn to carry their own weight." She woke with tears frozen on her face and the determination to keep moving. By the 3rd day, she was running on determination alone. Her body ached with exhaustion, her head felt light and strange, and she was fairly certain she had developed a fever. The cold had seeped into her bones, and every step felt like lifting stones. But she could see the boundary marker ahead. A tall stone pillar carved with the sigil of a black wolf beneath a crown, the Alpha King's territory stretching beyond. She hesitated at the border, one hand braced against the cold stone for support. Everything she had heard warned her away. The Alpha King was cruel. The Alpha King was merciless. The Alpha King had never taken a mate because no woman could survive his attention. But she had already survived cruelty. She had already experienced the mercilessness of those who were supposed to love her. What was one more monster? She stepped across the boundary line. The patrol found her less than an hour later. 3 wolves who materialized from the forest as silently as ghosts, led by a lean man with sandy hair and a noticeable limp in his left leg. He held up a hand to stop his companions from advancing, studying Valentina with eyes that were surprisingly warm in a face made for sternness. "You're trespassing," he said, but his tone was curious rather than threatening. "And you look about ready to collapse. What brings you to Shadowmere in such a state?" Valentina forced herself to straighten despite the way the world tilted dangerously around her. "I seek audience with the Alpha King. I was—" The word caught in her throat. "I was cast out of Ironhold Pack. For carrying a runt." Something shifted in the man's expression, a flash of recognition, almost of kinship. He glanced at his companions, some silent communication passing between them, then turned back to Valentina with a decision clearly made. "I am Alexander Morozov, Beta of Shadowmere. You may call me Sasha." He gestured toward the path ahead. "Come. You look like you need a healer more than you need an interrogation. We can sort out the formalities once you're not about to faint." She wanted to protest that she was fine, that she could stand on her own 2 feet, but the truth was she was not entirely certain that was accurate. So she nodded and followed, flanked by wolves who walked close enough to catch her if she fell, but made no move to restrain her. The difference from Ironhold's guards, who had handled her like livestock rather than a person, was stark enough to make her throat tighten. The castle of Shadowmere emerged from the forest like something out of a fever dream. Dark stone and tall towers, banners of black and silver snapping in the wind. It should have been foreboding, but something about its presence felt more like shelter than threat. Valentina climbed the steps to the great hall on legs that trembled with every stride, Sasha's hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching. Inside, the hall was nothing like Ironhold's cold formality. Fires roared in massive hearths along both walls, casting dancing shadows across dark wood and stone. The warmth hit Valentina like a physical wave, and she swayed with the sudden relief of it. Tapestries hung from the walls depicting scenes of wolves hunting and running and playing. Not battle scenes, she noted, but images of life and joy. At the far end of the hall, upon a throne carved from ancient oak, sat the Alpha King. He was not what she had expected. The stories spoke of a monster, a beast barely contained in human form, but the man before her was simply a man. Large, yes, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with raven-black hair pulled back from a face that bore the evidence of a hard life in the scar cutting through his left eyebrow. But his eyes, pale gray like winter storms, studied her with something that looked almost like concern rather than the cruelty she had braced for. "She crossed the border an hour ago," Sasha reported, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Says she was cast out of Ironhold for carrying a runt." The Alpha King's gaze dropped to her belly, then rose again to her face. He did not speak immediately, and in the silence, Valentina became acutely aware of how she must look. Travel-worn, feverish, desperate. She straightened her spine despite the effort it cost her, refusing to appear weak even when weakness was all she felt. "What is your name?" His voice was deep and quiet, nothing like the roar she had imagined. "Valentina Ashford." "And the father?" "Chose his Alpha's approval over his child's life." Something flickered in those gray eyes, anger perhaps, though not directed at her. He rose from the throne and descended the steps, and Valentina forced herself not to retreat as he approached. Up close, he was even more imposing, the sheer physical presence of him enough to make her wolf want to bare its throat in submission. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator at rest, someone who had nothing to prove and knew it. But he stopped several feet away, maintaining distance that felt deliberate rather than threatening. "Tell me your story," he said, "in your own words, not through messengers or intermediaries. Tell me what happened." So she did. She told him about the healer's verdict, About Cormac's order, about Marcus's silence. She told him about the coins pressed into her hand by a brave young woman and the gates closing behind her with the sound of her old life ending. She told him about 3 days of walking through snow, about the cottage and the cold, and the fear that she might not make it. She told him about the dreams of her mother and the determination to prove them all wrong. Through it all, he listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "When did you last eat?" The question was so unexpected that she actually laughed, a short, startled sound that held more exhaustion than humor. "I'm not sure. Yesterday, perhaps. I was rationing." He turned to a servant hovering near the wall. "Bring food, and summon the healer Ilara." "My lord." Valentina started, not sure what she intended to say. "You are not a prisoner," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "You are a guest. A pregnant woman who has been through an ordeal needs food and rest and medical attention. Politics can wait until you are not about to collapse." She wanted to argue, to insist that she was stronger than she looked, but her body chose that moment to betray her. The world tilted, her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if strong arms had not caught her. The Alpha King lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all, and the last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was his voice, quiet and firm. "I have you." She woke in a bed softer than any she had ever known, with sunlight streaming through tall windows and the smell of herbs sharp in her nostrils. An older woman with silver-streaked dark hair and wire-rimmed spectacles sat beside her, mixing something in a small bowl. Her hands were steady and sure, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime healing. "Ah, you're awake." The woman's voice was warm and practical. "I am Ilara, head healer of Shadowmere. You gave us quite a scare, fainting like that. But your fever has broken and your daughter is fine." "Daughter?" Valentina's hand flew to her belly. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without the birth itself." Ilara set down her bowl and reached out to press gentle fingers against Valentina's stomach. "She's strong, this one. Healthy. Growing exactly as she should be." The healers in Ironhold said she would be weak. A runt. The healers in Ironhold are fools. There was no anger in Ilara's voice, just simple statement of fact. Small does not mean weak. Slow to grow does not mean failure to thrive. I have delivered hundreds of pups in my years, and I can tell you that the size of the wolf at birth tells you very little about the wolf they will become. With proper care and nutrition, your daughter will be exactly what she is meant to be. She paused, meeting Valentina's eyes. "The Alpha King has offered you sanctuary here for as long as you need it. He asks nothing in return except that you contribute to the pack as you are able, once you are recovered." Valentina struggled to sit up despite Ilara's clucking disapproval. "Why? No one gives something for nothing. What does he want from me?" Ilara's expression softened into something almost sad, almost knowing. "He wants you to have the chance that someone once gave him. That is all." She rose, gathering her supplies. "Rest now. I will return this evening to check on you. If you need anything, there is a bell by the bed." She was gone before Valentina could ask what she meant. Over the following days, Valentina healed. She ate food that was plentiful and well prepared, slept in a bed that did not make her back ache, and received medical care that seemed designed to help rather than judge. Ilara visited twice daily, monitoring both mother and child with gentle efficiency, always ready with reassurance that the baby was thriving. The cottage assigned to her was small but comfortable, a single room with a bed, a hearth, a table and chairs, and a window that looked out over the castle gardens. Someone had placed flowers on the table, simple winter blooms that spoke of welcome rather than obligation. Someone had stocked the pantry with foods that were good for pregnant women. Someone had thought about what she might need and provided it without being asked. Slowly, cautiously, Valentina began to explore her new surroundings. Shadowmere was full of wolves who should not have existed, according to the belief she had been raised with. Warriors with old injuries that would have seen them cast out in Ironhold. Young wolves who had been born small or slow or different, now training alongside their larger peers. Women who had fled abusive situations in other packs, given shelter and safety without question. Elderly wolves who would have been abandoned as useless, now serving as teachers and craftspeople and keepers of stories. Why? She asked Sasha one afternoon, watching the training grounds where a young wolf half the size of his opponent danced circles around the larger male, using speed and agility to compensate for what he lacked in strength. The smaller wolf's movements were quick and clever, anticipating attacks before they came, turning his opponent's size into a disadvantage. Sasha followed her gaze, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Why what? Why does he collect us? The broken ones? The ones nobody else wants? She gestured at the field before them, at the evidence of some philosophy she could not quite grasp. Other alphas would see this as weakness. Other alphas are wrong. Sasha's voice was matter of fact. Size is only one kind of strength. Speed is another. Intelligence, strategy, determination. These are all weapons. A wolf who has had to fight for everything they have is a wolf who knows how to survive when things go wrong. The Alpha King understands that better than anyone. How? She paused, unsure how to phrase it without giving offense. The most powerful alpha in 5 territories? Sasha's smile widened. He wasn't always. Before he was the Alpha King, he was just a boy named Nikolai, who everyone expected to die before his first winter. Valentina's breath caught. What do you mean? But Sasha only shook his head, his expression turning enigmatic. It's not my story to tell. But ask him sometime, if you're brave enough. He doesn't share it often, but I think he might tell you. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. That evening, unable to sleep, Valentina wandered the castle until she found herself in the library, a vast room lined with books from floor to ceiling, the air thick with the smell of old paper and binding glue. Ladders on brass rails allowed access to the highest shelves, and comfortable chairs were scattered throughout, positioned near windows and fireplaces for optimal reading light. She expected it to be empty at this hour. She found the Alpha King sitting alone by the dying fire, a book of children's tales open on his lap. He looked up at her approach, but made no move to close the book or hide what he was reading. In the firelight, the harsh lines of his face seemed softer, younger, less like a monster, and more like a man carrying a weight he could not set down. Could not sleep? He asked. The baby is restless. She moved to a chair across from him, drawn by curiosity stronger than caution. She wakes me often. My mother said the same about me. His thumb brushed across the page of the open book, and Valentina caught a glimpse of an illustration, a small wolf standing alone against a much larger pack. She used to read to me from this book when I was young, tales of underdogs who overcame impossible odds. You kept it. It was hers. She died when I was 12. He closed the book with care, but did not set it aside. Fever. The healers could not save her. I sat beside her bed for 3 days, reading to her from this book, hoping that somehow the stories would give her strength to survive. They did not. But I kept reading them anyway, because they reminded me of her voice. Valentina was quiet for a moment, recognizing an offered confidence and treating it with the respect it deserved. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But his hand remained on the book's cover, as if drawing comfort from the worn leather. She gathered her courage. Why did you help me? Truly. He was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. When he spoke, his voice was low. rough with something that might have been old pain. When I was born, I was the smallest of 5 pups. So small, the healers told my parents it would be kinder to let me die than to waste resources trying to keep me alive. His gray eyes met hers, and in them she saw a reflection of every fear she had carried since the moment she learned of her child's diagnosis. They called me Runt. They said I would never shift, never be strong, never amount to anything. They said I was a mistake. But you became Alpha King. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. Not despite being born small. Because of it. I had to be smarter than wolves who relied on size, faster than wolves who relied on strength, more strategic than wolves who relied on fear. I learned to use my disadvantages as weapons, because no one saw me coming. While my brothers were praised for their size, I was studying. While they wrestled and played, I was learning to read the movements of my opponents before they made them. When I finally challenged for Alpha, no one expected me to win. That was their mistake. Valentina found herself leaning forward, hungry for this story in a way she could not explain. How? I refused to accept their definition of my worth. His voice was steady now, strengthened by conviction. My mother refused first. She fought to keep me alive when everyone told her to let me go. She believed in me before I could believe in myself. And when I was strong enough to fight my own battles, I swore that no one would ever define another child's value by the size of their wolf. Is that why you built this pack? All these wolves who were cast out, they were told they were worthless. They were wrong. He set the book aside and leaned forward, his gaze intent. Your daughter is not a weakness to be eliminated. She is a possibility waiting to be realized. I cannot tell you what she will become, but I can tell you this. No child born with a mother willing to sacrifice everything for them is destined to be weak. Valentina's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. How can you be so certain? Because I was her. He rose from his chair, and for a moment he seemed to fill the entire library with his presence. Not through intimidation, but through the simple weight of conviction. Sleep well, Valentina. Your daughter needs you rested. He left her there among the books and the dying fire, and for the first time since her exile, the future felt less like a threat and more like a promise. The days stretched into weeks, and Valentina found herself settling into life at Shadowmere with an ease that surprised her. She began teaching again, simple lessons for the youngest pack members who did not know or care about her history, only that she made learning fun. She helped Alara in the healing rooms, discovering a talent for soothing anxious patients that made her valuable beyond her own needs. She learned the names of her neighbors, the rhythms of pack life, the unspoken rules that governed a community built on second chances. She learned that Sasha had been left in the forest to die as an infant because of his twisted leg, found by Nikolai's mother and raised alongside her own children. She learned that the gruff captain of the guard had once been a slave in another territory, freed when Nikolai conquered his former masters. She learned that the gentle woman who tended the gardens had fled a violent mating arrangement, and that Nikolai had personally faced down her former pack when they came to reclaim her. Everywhere she looked, she found evidence of the philosophy that made Shadowmere different. Strength was not measured in size alone, and those who had been broken could become the strongest of all. And slowly, carefully, she began to trust. The message arrived on a gray morning when the first hints of spring were beginning to soften the winter's grip. A rider from Ironhold, wearing Cormac's colors, demanding audience with the Alpha King. Valentina stood in the great hall among the gathered pack as the messenger delivered his master's demands. She heard her own name spoken like a curse, heard herself described as a thief of pack property, heard her unborn child called an abomination that threatened the purity of wolfkind. She heard Nikolai's response, cold and precise, and utterly uncompromising. He did not recognize Cormac's authority over those Cormac had cast out. She was under his protection. This was not negotiable. The messenger left. Everyone knew what would follow. He will come himself, Nikolai said in the war council that night. The inner circle had gathered in his private chambers. Sasha, Ilara, the captain of the guard, and, at Nikolai's insistence, Valentina herself. His pride will not allow anything less, and when he does, we will not simply defeat him, we will destroy everything he believes. You're not just planning for battle, Valentina said, studying the map spread across the table. You're planning for something else. Nikolai met her eyes, and she saw respect there. The acknowledgement of an equal, rather than a subordinate. Cormac's power comes from his ideology, the belief that strength is measured only in size, and that the weak must be culled. If we simply defeat him in combat, another will rise to take his place, carrying the same poison. We must defeat the idea itself. How? By showing everyone who witnesses it that the idea is a lie, by proving that the wolves he would have killed are stronger than the wolves he kept. Valentina insisted on being present for the confrontation. Nikolai argued against it, his concern for her safety genuine in a way that still surprised her, but ultimately he yielded to her right to face her own persecutor. It is your fight, he acknowledged. I will not take it from you. Cormac arrived 1 week later with 50 warriors at his back. A show of force meant to intimidate, to remind everyone of the power that backed his ideology. They arrived in formation, armor gleaming, every wolf selected for size and visible strength. Cormac himself rode at their head, his cold blue eyes scanning the walls of Shadowmere as if calculating the effort required to tear them down. Nikolai allowed him through the gates with only 2 witnesses, a condition Cormac accepted because refusing would have been an admission of fear. The great hall was packed to capacity when the confrontation began. Torches blazed along the walls, casting everything in flickering orange light. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Valentina stood among the assembled pack, one hand resting on her belly, feeling her daughter kick restlessly within her. Cormac made his case with the conviction of a true believer. Valentina was a criminal, a thief who had stolen herself from her rightful owners. Her child was a defect, a weakness that would spread through the bloodlines like disease if allowed to survive. Nikolai was a fool, wasting his resources on the broken and the worthless, building a pack that would crumble at the first serious challenge. Nikolai let him speak. Let him vent his poison until the entire hall had heard every word of his hateful philosophy. Then he called forward the wolves of Shadowmere. Sasha stepped forward first, his limp pronounced as he walked to stand before the assembly. I was born with a twisted leg, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. My birth pack left me in the forest to die. I am now beta of the most powerful pack in 5 territories. A warrior followed, massive, scarred, clearly formidable. I was blinded in one eye by my own father because I hesitated to kill a prisoner. He called me weak. The Alpha King called me principled. One by one they came forward, young and old, male and female, each with a story of rejection and redemption. Each living proof that Cormac's ideology was built on lies. And then Nikolai himself stepped forward. I was born the smallest of 5, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. The healers told my parents to let me die. They called me Runt, told me I would never amount to anything, said I was a mistake that should never have happened. The hall had gone utterly silent. Cormac's face had drained of color. Your ideology would have killed me before I drew my first breath. Nikolai advanced on Cormac, and the older Alpha retreated without seeming to realize he was doing it. And yet, here I stand, Alpha King, master of the territory you so desperately wish to threaten. Tell me, Cormac Steele, does this look like weakness to you? Cormac's certainty shattered visibly, but desperation made him dangerous. Words, he spat, pretty words to mask the truth. True strength comes from pure bloodlines, from fear. Nikolai's voice cut through his ranting like a blade. That is all your ideology has ever been. Fear of difference. Fear of what you do not understand. Fear that if strength comes in forms you cannot measure, then perhaps you are not as powerful as you believe. I challenge you. The words burst from Cormac like a trapped animal's last desperate gambit. Combat, the old way. Let us see whose strength is true. Nikolai smiled. A cold, terrible expression that finally lived up to his fearsome reputation. Accepted. The circle cleared in the center of the hall, torchlight flickering across the space where two alphas would determine the fate of everything Valentina had come to love. She found herself pressed against the wall, one hand covering her mouth, the other cradling her belly where her daughter kicked and squirmed as if sensing the violence about to unfold. Cormac was larger than Nikolai by perhaps an inch and 20 pounds, advantages he clearly believed would matter. He launched himself forward with the confidence of a wolf who had won every fight through sheer physical dominance, expecting his opponent to meet force with force. Nikolai was not there. He moved like water, like shadow, like something that existed between spaces. Every blow Cormac threw met empty air. Every advance was countered by retreat that was somehow also attack. A strike to the knee, an elbow to the jaw, a sweep that sent the larger wolf crashing to the ground only to have Nikolai already moving away before Cormac could grab him. It was not a fight of strength. It was a lesson in everything strength could not do. Cormac grew more frustrated with each failed attack, his movements becoming wilder, less controlled. He was fighting an enemy who would not stand still, who would not play by the rules Cormac had built his entire worldview around. Every technique that had won him victory before was useless against an opponent who had spent his whole life learning to defeat larger wolves. When it ended, Cormac was on his back with Nikolai's hand around his throat, beaten not by superior power but by superior strategy. Valentina watched Nikolai's face in the torchlight, watched him make the choice that would define what kind of Alpha King he truly was. He let go. Cormac sucked in air, coughing, confusion and fury warring in his eyes. Finish it. That is how this ends. No. Nikolai rose, stepping back from his defeated opponent. That is how your way ends. My way offers something different. He turned to address the hall, his voice ringing with authority. Ironhold Pack is hereby placed under Shadowmere's protection. Cormac Steele is stripped of his rank. Those who wish to continue following his ideology may leave this territory and never return. Those who wish to learn a different way may stay. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, wolves began to kneel. Cormac's own witnesses first, then more and more of the Ironhold warriors who had accompanied him, choosing in that moment between an ideology of destruction and a future that offered something more. 1 month later, the Great Hall was transformed. Where there had been tension, there was celebration. Where there had been judgment, there was joy. Spring flowers decorated every surface, and the smell of feast food filled the air. And in Valentina's arms, wrapped in soft blankets and making the small, fierce sounds of a newborn who had already survived more than anyone expected, her daughter drew her first breaths as a member of Shadowmere Pack. Aurora, Valentina whispered, tracing the curve of her daughter's cheek, because you are the dawn. Nikolai stood beside her, the fearsome Alpha King reduced to something almost gentle, as he looked down at the tiny creature whose existence had reshaped the fate of kingdoms. She has your stubbornness, he observed. She refused to arrive until she was ready, no matter what the healers predicted. Perhaps she has learned already that other people's predictions do not define her. Valentina looked up at him, and something passed between them that needed no words. Recognition, respect. The first fragile roots of something that might someday grow into more. Thank you. For everything. Thank yourself. His gray eyes were warm in a way she had never expected to see. You walked through snow and fear and an entire world that told you to give up, and you never did. I merely provided a place to land. The pack gathered around them, celebrating the new life that represented everything they believed. That worth was not measured in size, that strength took 1,000 forms, that those the world discarded could rise to become its greatest treasures. And in the warmth of that hall, surrounded by wolves who had all been told they would never be enough, Valentina finally allowed herself to believe that the hardest part was over. The future was still uncertain. Aurora would face challenges, as all children did, perhaps more than most given the shadow of her beginning. Cormac's ideology had not died with his defeat. There would always be those who believed that weakness should be culled, that only the largest and strongest deserved to survive. But Aurora would face those challenges with a mother who had already fought the world for her, in a pack that valued determination over size and heart, over brutality. She would grow up knowing that she was celebrated, not merely tolerated. She would learn that true strength meant lifting others rather than crushing them beneath you. And she would have stories to inspire her, tales of underdogs who overcame impossible odds, read to her from a worn book that had once belonged to an Alpha King's mother, given to a boy the world had written off as worthless, and who had grown up to prove them all wrong. Nikolai watched Valentina cradle her daughter, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that held more than duty. He had built Shadowmere as a sanctuary, a place where the discarded could become valuable. He had never expected to find someone who understood why it mattered. But watching her now, fierce and gentle, exhausted and radiant, holding proof that love was stronger than any ideology, he thought perhaps the universe had decided to show him that even the most solitary wolf could find pack again. Outside the castle walls, spring had finally arrived. Snow melted from the mountains, feeding streams that would nourish the valleys below. New life pushed through the cold earth, reaching for the sun. The world was waking from its long sleep, ready for beginnings. And in the great hall of Shadowmere, a child named for the dawn opened her eyes for the first time, already proving wrong everyone who had ever doubted her worth.